Today on Listen Up, getting the facts you need from government census to self-awareness. Find out how probing for personal details will help you. Welcome to Listen Up. I'm Lorna Duick. Today, we'll explore the value of getting good information. There was unprecedented complaint over the Canadian government's handling of a national census when it made a move to eliminate the mandatory collection of information on our personal lives. We'll dig into that controversy in a moment. And then we'll look at the very private business of knowing your own personal data. How do you collect those facts and what do you do with them to make a better life? That's in today's program as we take you deeper on the value of getting good information. Well, first, why the Canadian Church blew the whistle on a government plan to eliminate the mandatory census in the country. And we're joined by Reverend Dr. Karen Hamilton of the Canadian Council of Churches and Rick Hiemstra, Director of the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada's Centre for Research on Canadian Evangelicalism. And Rick, let's start with you because you began blogging these complaints. A very formal letter went off to the government over the reduction of the mandatory census. Why was this a concern?
Well, aside from the information that's collected on the census is important because of how it's woven into the fabric of how we make public policy decisions in Canada, how minority groups are treated in the country. It affects religious freedoms. It is so central a part of who we are as Canadians at this point that we thought it was very important both for evangelicals but for everyone in Canada.
You know, I should have asked, when the government is holding its hearings again to say maybe we have made a mistake here, was the church invited?
We were invited to participate in two consultations that Stats Canada held about the census, and we were particularly concerned as evangelicals with the religious affiliation question. And they were held in the years leading up to the census on the dissemination of the census and the content, and at no time did the government ever indicate that they were considering dropping the long form of the census.
Okay, Karen, as a clergywoman, what would you use the information on a census for? Help us understand why that's valuable to a church leader.
Well, I can answer that both in the positive and in a sense in the negative. It's really important to know your people, to know your context, to know your country. So yes, you would want more information in order to be faithfully witnessing in your context with as much understanding of the context. The negative way I would answer it would be to simply say, I am still unclear, and you probably are too, but why this became such an issue for the government. In terms of civic responsibility and duty, in a sense, one could say, what's the big deal about filling out paperwork and a form so that we all understand our context better?
Well, we took those kind of worries to one of Canada's leading pollsters. The big controversy really is the fear that if we lose the reliability of data, if the government moves to making it voluntarily. So here's what pollster Daryl Bricker had to say on that concern.
All of it comes down to the question of how truthful are people being in their responses. So the first thing is, we know that in the last long-form census, 21,000 people reported their religion as Jedi. Do we have 21,000 Jedis in this country? I don't know. But people are misreporting data all the time, sometimes maliciously, sometimes because they have a political agenda.
Okay, so if the free information the government is getting on the mandatory source isn't reliable, where would you get it? Karen, where would you start?
Well, I'd first actually start responding to that point about the free information, and I'm sure that's true that some people do say things that aren't exactly how others would perceive them, but a lot of people do answer the census totally honestly and fairly, so that needs to be in the mix.
Rick, how about you? Where does that information come from then, if the free is not a good source?
Well, the information is provided by Canadians free of charge. But I just want to come back to the issue of the Jedi. You know,
Everyone loves that one.
you know, on the one hand, we can dismiss it, but I don't think we should be too quick to dismiss it. These questions have been asked over the years, and I think that we'd be remiss to think that we're only now seeing the introduction of errors. Part of the value of the census is being able to see trends long term. And if this is part of the trend about how Canadians are perceiving religion in Canada, I think that we have to, in some sense, take that at face value.
It is interesting that it's the one issue that gets mocked and immediately discredited on the census is religion. So is that an early indicator on the freedom of religion concerns, that if you do not get an accurate reading, it starts to be minimized in the country, the value of religion?
I'll say this about freedom of religion and how the census feeds into that. We tend to lose our freedom of religion if religious groups become marginalized. And there's two ways that they tend to become marginalized. One is when they lose visibility. So, for instance, if you had to go home on a dark night, if there were two ways you could pick, one was down a very lonely path and another was past some cafes where people were sitting out eating and drinking, you would choose that way because there's protection and visibility. The census offers protection to people in religious minorities and all minority groups. The other is participation. And when the EFC intervenes in a court case, one of the things that the court asks us to do is to estimate the size of our constituency. And so when you're in a culture like ours that is increasingly suspicious, when we can go to an independent source like StatCan and bring their number, that is accepted. And it opens up a place for us to have conversations. It opens up doors for us to participate in deliberations, not just about court cases, but about how we as Canadians together make decisions about how we're going to govern ourselves.
And how we begin. It's interesting because our pollster, Daryl Bricker, has a very interesting point on this, on how we should be looking for solutions on gathering information. Here's Daryl Bricker.
Well, the solutions are having a very good voluntary long-form census that's really well communicated to the public, in which they feel a real patriotic desire to participate in the filling out of the census. And if we can convince them that it's really valuable to do, they're less likely to lie about it, they're less likely to not answer certain questions, they're more likely to participate. And I really think that's the challenge going forward, rather than putting in some form of draconian law forcing people to respond.
All right, so the pollster, Daryl Bricker, tells us appeal to patriotism. Is that a good enough answer for you, Rick?
You know, what we're concerned about are the people who tend not to answer the question. If we're appealing to patriotism, those people are already answering the census. So by making those kinds of appeals, you're still going to miss those people on the margins. And justice for them, whether they're the poor, or homeless, whether they're religious minorities, ethnic minorities, those groups still will be invisible in the country, will make less accommodation for them, and they're still left out in the cold when we paint this national portrait.
And Karen, there is spiritual history in our literature for the use and the non-use of census. What lessons do you conclude from the Bibles?
Well, for sure it's complex. If you look at Numbers 26, there is a command, a divine command to conduct a census. If you look at 1 Chronicles 21, there is a divine imperative not to command a census. So it means that it is complex. It means that we need to do thinking, praying, reflecting on the issue of a census and not make arbitrary or facile kinds of decisions. So I would like to see the kind of conversation about it in the churches, in the faith communities, with your kind of research, continue with the government. We're all in this together. It feels in this process as if the government is making decisions for us, and we are the people of this democratic country, and so let's talk about it together.
All right, well, we're going to switch gears now and move on to the value of gathering personal information that goes back and forth between us and God. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
When we come back, moving off the government's agenda for information and onto your own, we take a look at the information on our emotions, and a leading professor says happiness at work, home, and play all require that you know your emotional facts. How to figure those out when we return.